When I told my mother my brother wasn't invited to my wedding, I thought I was finally choosing peace over guilt. But in my family, silence is never empty, it's loaded. By the time I stood at the altar, I realized my mother's idea of love wasn't forgiveness, it was control. When my engagement to Laura became official, I thought the stormy part of my life had finally passed and that peace was here to stay. We had been together for 3 years, building something steady and genuine after years of false starts and disappointments. I remember standing with her on a quiet pier one late evening when she said yes to my proposal and the wind carried the scent of rain and salt across the water. Everything about that night felt certain and clear. I had no idea that the people waiting back home would turn that certainty into a maze of guilt and noise before the wedding day even arrived. My family has always had a strange idea of loyalty. We were never the kind that shouted or slammed doors, but rather the kind that smiled through clenched teeth and talked about forgiveness like it was a moral competition. My mother in particular believed that unity mattered more than truth. She was the sort of woman who thought silence could fix anything if you held it long enough. She hated division and could twist any argument into an obligation to love the person who hurt you. I grew up watching her mediate fights between relatives who never actually changed. I used to think she was wise for keeping everyone together, but lately I have started to see that she only learned how to cover bruises with polite words. The main source of those bruises in my life has always been my older brother Mark. He is the kind of man who believes charm excuses everything. Growing up, I admired him and copied almost every habit he had. He could make friends anywhere and could lie without blinking if it saved him from trouble. When we were younger, I used to think that kind of confidence was impressive until I became the person paying for his mistakes. By the time we were adults, our relationship had drifted into this quiet competition that neither of us admitted existed. I tried to stay away from it by focusing on my own goals, but somehow Mark always found a way to reappear whenever I was doing well. It started subtly with him showing up at my college parties and charming the people I introduced him to. Then he would ask to borrow money or a contact or a favor, and I would give in every single time. The last big disaster happened 6 years ago when I was dating a woman named Claire. Mark had been unemployed for months and came to stay with me. Within weeks, Claire was gone and so was Mark. I found out later they had run off together for a few months before that fell apart too. It broke something inside me, but my mother convinced me not to make it a family war. She said Mark was young and confused and that forgiveness was the Christian thing to do. I cut him off quietly, but she kept bringing him up during every phone call. Eventually I stopped answering her calls altogether. So when Laura and I began planning our wedding, I made a promise to myself that it would be the beginning of a different kind of life, one built on peace, not guilt. I told my mother early on that I would not be inviting Mark. The words felt heavy but necessary. She looked at me the same way she used to when I broke something expensive as a kid and told me that holding grudges was poison. I explained that it was not about grudges but about boundaries. She sighed and said boundaries were just another word for selfishness. That was when I knew she would not let this go easily. As the wedding date came closer, my phone started filling with messages from her that all sounded like they came from a script about family unity. She said I would regret breaking the family apart. She said our father would be ashamed. She said Mark had changed and deserved another chance. Then one afternoon she called crying, telling me she would not attend the wedding unless her 2 sons were both invited. I could hear my father's quiet voice in the background telling her to calm down, but he did not intervene. He never did. The weight of her words sank into me like stones tied around my ankles. For a moment I almost gave in just to stop the pressure, but something inside me held firm. Laura told me that she would support whatever I decided, but she also gently reminded me that our wedding was supposed to be about us, not about old wounds. I tried to believe that, but the closer the day came, the more it felt like the past was sneaking into every corner of our plans. My mother sent me a photo of Mark holding a small gift box with a note saying he wanted to make amends. I could not tell if the picture was meant to melt my heart or guilt me into submission. I ignored it, but the image kept replaying in my mind. That night I dreamed about standing at the altar and seeing Mark walk in dressed in a suit, grinning like nothing had ever happened. In the dream everyone else clapped while I stood frozen, unable to speak. When I woke up my heart was racing and I knew that something inside me still feared him more than I wanted to admit. It was not fear of confrontation but fear of losing control again. I decided that no matter what happened I would not let him near my wedding. The next morning my mother called again, but this time her voice was calm, almost too calm. She said she understood my decision and that she would respect it. I wanted to believe her, but the tone in her voice carried a faint echo of triumph rather than surrender. I asked her directly if she had spoken to Mark, and she said only that family matters have a way of sorting themselves out. After I hung up I sat by the window watching the grey light spread across the street, and I could not shake the feeling that something was being planned behind my back. That was 3 weeks before the ceremony, and every day since then has felt like waiting for a storm that refuses to arrive yet never disappears from the horizon. The following weeks were filled with a kind of anxious quiet that makes every phone vibration sound like trouble on the way. Laura and I were finalizing the guest list, the seating chart and the playlist, while a thin thread of tension kept pulling at me. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mother had accepted my choice and that I could finally enjoy the process of building our day. Yet every time I looked at my phone there would be another small reminder that the peace was only temporary. Sometimes it was a message from my aunt asking if Mark would attend, or a text from a cousin saying she hoped the brothers would finally reconcile during the celebration. Those small notes might have seemed harmless to anyone else, but to me they felt coordinated, like soft little pushes leading toward the same inevitable point. One afternoon Laura and I went to visit the venue to check the lighting for the ceremony. The manager was walking us through the layout when I noticed something strange on the printed schedule pinned near his desk. My mother's name was written in the section for vendor coordination as a secondary contact. I asked him who had added that, and he said she had called last week saying he was helping organize family logistics and wanted to make sure everything ran smoothly. My stomach tightened as I thanked him and we left. Laura could tell I was shaken and asked if I was all right. I told her what had happened and she sighed softly, saying she had a feeling my mother might not give up that easily. That evening I called my parents' house and my mother answered on the second ring. She sounded cheerful, as if nothing were wrong. I asked her directly why she had contacted the venue. She laughed a little too quickly and said she only wanted to ensure that everything was perfect for me. When I pressed further she told me that Mark had reached out to her wanting to make amends and that she thought maybe this was a sign that God wanted us to reunite as brothers. The way she said it made it sound like she had already decided it was going to happen whether I liked it or not. I told her firmly that I did not want him there. She went silent for a long moment and then said something that chilled me. She said she understood, but that family sometimes surprises us when we least expect it. After that call I could not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about what she might do. The rational part of me said she would not dare cross such a clear boundary, but the other part, the one that had watched her twist guilt into obligation for years, knew better. The next morning I told Laura everything and she suggested we add security at the venue entrance. The idea felt dramatic but sensible. We spoke to the manager and arranged for an additional staff member to verify names against the guest list. It felt awkward explaining that this was about a family situation, but he nodded with understanding, like he had seen worse. In the days that followed I tried to shift my focus back to normal wedding tasks. My best friend Evan came by to help me pick up the suits and we ended up laughing about how surreal it felt to be this close to marriage. He asked if I was nervous and I admitted that I was, but not about the marriage itself, more about the noise around it. He told me not to let anyone steal the joy from it. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way my mother had spoken still lingered in my chest. 2 days later a package arrived at our apartment. It was addressed to both Laura and me, but there was no return label. Inside was a silver picture frame containing a photo from my childhood. It was of Mark and me sitting on the steps of our old house, grinning with scraped knees and matching toy cars in our hands. Behind the photo was a short handwritten note that said only "It is time to forgive." There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. I felt a dull anger rising as I held the frame. Laura put her hand on my shoulder and asked what I wanted to do with it. Without saying anything I placed it back in the box, taped it shut and put it in the closet. The next morning my father called, which was unusual because he rarely initiated contact. His voice was tired and he said that he hoped I was not angry with my mother because she was only trying to keep the family together. He added that she had been under a lot of stress lately and that she truly believed Mark had changed. I asked him quietly if Mark had been invited. There was a pause long enough to confirm my worst suspicion before he finally said that my mother might have mentioned the date and location during a conversation but that she did not mean harm. He said it the way someone describes knocking over a vase. That evening I sat in our living room staring at the guest list again. I realized that even with security I could not control everything. My mother was determined to rewrite this story in her own way, and Mark was the key character she wanted back on stage. Laura sat beside me reading quietly, but I could tell she was keeping an eye on me. She said that no matter what happened the two of us would handle it together. That helped more than she knew. Still, I felt a growing unease that this situation was heading toward something larger than a ruined guest list. A few nights later I got a text from an unknown number that said, "Can we talk before the wedding? I promise it is important." There was no name, but I knew exactly who it was. I deleted it without replying, yet the simple act of seeing his number again after all those years left my hands shaking. I wanted to tell Laura, but something in me hesitated, maybe out of embarrassment, maybe out of exhaustion. I just turned off the phone and went to bed. The following morning when I woke up, the phone was back on the nightstand and there was another message waiting from the same number. It said, "I already got my invitation, no need to worry." My chest went cold as I read it. The implication was clear. Someone had sent him one. For the rest of that morning I moved through the apartment in a haze somewhere between disbelief and anger. The words from that message kept circling in my head like a fly I could not swat away. I already got my invitation. I knew I had not sent it, and I knew Laura had not either. Which left only one possibility. My mother had gone behind my back again. I wanted to call her right away, but I stopped myself. I had learned over the years that confronting her too early only gave her time to twist the situation into a misunderstanding. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to think. I opened the wedding spreadsheet where Laura and I had logged every invitation. The entries looked normal, each name checked off in neat blue rows. I traced my finger down the list and then I saw it. A new line added near the bottom, written in a slightly different font. Mark Harrison plus guest. The timestamp showed it had been edited a week ago. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse rise until my vision blurred slightly around the edges. I remembered giving my mother access to that list months ago when she had offered to help me mail invitations to distant relatives. She must have used it. I shut the laptop and just sat there staring at the wall. Laura came out of the bedroom tying her hair up, and when she saw my face she froze. I told her what I had found and she leaned against the counter, eyes wide with the kind of tired disbelief that said she was done being surprised. She asked if I wanted her to call the venue and have the staff flag the name. I nodded and she went to make the call while I sat there trying to steady my breathing. By the time she came back, the coffee pot had gone cold. She said the venue manager understood and that they would make sure no extra guests entered without my approval. That should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. I kept picturing my mother smiling at her phone, thinking she had done something noble. I imagined her telling Mark about forgiveness and second chances and how his little brother had finally matured enough to let go of the past. The thought made me sick. The rest of that week felt unreal. My phone stayed silent, but I could feel the weight of unseen movement behind it, all like invisible strings being pulled in another room. The rehearsal dinner came first and I braced myself the entire evening for the sound of Mark's voice behind me. It never came, but I noticed my mother watching the door every few minutes as if expecting him to appear. She kept giving me those brittle smiles that never reached her eyes. My father sat beside her looking small and silent. I knew he had no control over any of this, and yet part of me resented him for his quiet loyalty to her peacekeeping crusade. The night before the wedding I barely slept. Laura lay beside me breathing softly while I stared at the ceiling, tracing faint cracks in the plaster. I wondered if it was possible to ruin a wedding without even attending it. My mother had managed to fill the day with dread long before it started. I promised myself I would not let it show when the time came. I would stand there beside Laura and make it about us, not about the past. Morning came early with sunlight leaking through the blinds in thin pale stripes. The hotel suite was already buzzing with quiet chaos, hairstylists, photographers, caterers moving in and out. I went through the motions of dressing, smiling at friends, trying to look calm. My stomach felt hollow. When my mother knocked on the door, I almost pretended not to hear, but she called my name again and something in her tone made me open it. She stood there holding a small white envelope. She said she wanted to give me something before the ceremony. Her voice was gentle, the way it always got when she was about to ask for forgiveness instead of offering it. I took the envelope and she reached up to adjust my tie like she used to when I was a boy. She said she was proud of me and that today was going to be beautiful no matter what. Then she turned and walked away before I could answer. Inside the envelope was a folded note written in her looping cursive. It said, "Family cannot heal without courage. Today will bring what it must." I wanted to tear it in half, but I tucked it into my pocket instead because some part of me knew I might need to remember those words later, if only to make sense of whatever was coming. When the ceremony began, everything looked perfect. The weather was mild, the music soft, the air filled with that warm sense of anticipation that always precedes a major turning point. Laura walked down the aisle glowing and steady. For a few minutes I felt my body relax and the noise in my head quieted. I focused on her hands in mine, on the sound of our vows echoing through the small courtyard. Then near the end of the ceremony, when the guests rose to applaud, I saw movement near the back row. A man in a grey suit stepped into the sunlight with the kind of easy confidence I had tried for years to forget. He was smiling at me the same way he used to smile when he had done something terrible but expected me to admire him for it anyway. My brother had come after all. My mother stood beside him, clapping through her tears as though she had orchestrated a miracle. The guests turned to see what the commotion was while the officiant hesitated mid-sentence. Laura squeezed my hand hard enough to pull me back to the moment, but I could barely breathe. The one thing I had feared most was happening exactly as my mother had promised when she said family sometimes surprises us. For a long second I did nothing, just stared across the crowd while Mark lifted a hand in a mock salute. Then instinct took over. I stepped forward toward the officiant and quietly asked him to continue. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. He nodded and resumed the closing line of the ceremony. I heard the guests clapping again, though it sounded distant, muffled by the pounding in my ears. As soon as it was over, I turned to see where Mark had gone, but he was no longer standing beside my mother. He had slipped away somewhere into the reception area. Laura looked at me with a question she did not need to speak. I told her silently with my eyes that I would handle it. I did not know how yet, but I knew I had to confront whatever game my mother had started before it ruined the rest of the day. The reception started with a haze of congratulations and polite laughter, yet all I could think about was where Mark had gone. Every face that turned toward me blurred into a single expression of cheerfulness that felt increasingly unreal. I tried to follow the rhythm of small talk, smiling, nodding, shaking hands, while my thoughts kept scanning the edges of the room. The air smelled of garden roses and roasted food, but beneath that sweetness there was the sharp undercurrent of anxiety building quietly in my chest. Laura stayed near me, her calm presence grounding me as she guided guests toward the buffet line and the dance floor. She was brilliant at creating ease where none existed, and I loved her for that. But every few minutes her eyes flicked toward me, and I knew she sensed how tightly wound I was. When the band began its first slow song, she leaned closer and whispered that I should take a walk outside, breathe for a minute, maybe clear my head before I imploded. She was right. I slipped through the back door of the venue where the air felt cooler and quieter and the sound of laughter dulled behind the walls. The courtyard lights cast a faint amber glow over the gravel path. I followed it around to the far side of the building, and there he was, leaning against the stone railing as if he had been waiting. Mark. Same posture, same crooked grin, same maddening calm. He had a glass of champagne in one hand and his tie hung loose around his neck. When he saw me, he lifted the glass slightly as if in greeting. I stopped several feet away, not trusting myself to get any closer. My body felt like a spring wound too tight. I had spent years imagining this moment, rehearsing what I would say if I ever saw him again, but now that he was standing there I could not find a single word that did not sound childish in my head. He said something I could not quite hear over the wind, then took a slow sip from his glass. I told myself to stay calm, to remember that losing control was exactly what he expected of me. He started talking again, this time louder, and I caught fragments about forgiveness and about how life was too short for grudges. It was the same language my mother always used, and I realized with a sick twist that he was repeating her script almost word for word. He said he wanted to start fresh, that he had changed, that he was proud of me for finding someone like Laura. The words sounded smooth, rehearsed, soulless. I asked him why he was here, and he shrugged in that old way of his that turned defiance into charm. He said Mom invited him and he could not refuse because she had told him it would break her heart if both her sons weren't present. Hearing that, I felt something in me snap. I stepped closer and told him quietly that he should leave before I asked security to do it for him. He chuckled like it was a joke and said that would only make me look small on my own wedding day. Then he added that Mom wanted us to take a photo together for the family album. The idea of that photograph filled me with a kind of nausea I cannot describe. I told him again to go and turned away before he could see how unsteady I felt. I walked back toward the door and did not look behind me. Inside the reception hall the air felt thicker somehow. My mother was standing near the cake table, her eyes scanning the crowd like a stage manager checking her actors. When she saw me, her expression softened with that same guilty sweetness. I walked up to her and asked if she had invited him. She didn't even deny it. She just said that she knew I would be angry at first but that I would thank her later. She said it like she was talking about medicine I had refused to take. I told her she had crossed a line that I did not know if I could forgive her for it. She looked hurt, then defensive, and told me she had done what was necessary to heal the family. For a long second we stood there in silence, surrounded by laughter and clinking glasses. Then she asked where Mark was and I told her he was outside. Her eyes brightened and she started toward the door, but I caught her wrist and told her not to. I said if she brought him back in I would leave. The shock in her face lasted only a heartbeat before she pulled her hand away and said softly that one day I would understand. She turned and disappeared into the crowd. Laura found me standing alone a few minutes later. She asked if I was all right and I told her the truth. I said I was tired of carrying my family's unfinished battles. She listened quietly and then said something that would stay with me. She said sometimes peace is not about forgiveness but about distance. Her words settled deep inside me like an anchor. We managed to finish the evening without further disruption. Guests danced, toasted, laughed, and for brief stretches I even joined them, pretending everything was normal. But near the end of the night, when people began saying their goodbyes, I noticed my mother standing by the exit talking to someone whose face I could not see. When she turned slightly I realized it was Mark again, and they were both smiling through tears. He handed her something small, maybe a folded piece of paper, before slipping out into the dark. She tucked it into her purse quickly when she saw me watching. Later, after everyone had left and Laura was gathering her things, I noticed that same purse sitting unattended on a chair. I should have ignored it, but curiosity and dread are stronger than manners. I opened it and there inside was a small envelope with my name written on it in my brother's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before sliding it into my jacket pocket. That night in the hotel suite while Laura slept, I sat by the window listening to the quiet hum of city lights below. I took out the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single photograph from years ago, the same one my mother had mailed earlier, showing the two of us as kids sitting on the steps of our old house. On the back he had written a short message in pen. It said, "She told me everything. We should talk soon." There was no signature. I read that line again and again until the ink seemed to blur. She told me everything. I did not know what that meant or what version of everything my mother had chosen to share, but whatever it was, I knew it was not the truth I remembered. The next morning would mark the beginning of my married life, yet I had the uneasy feeling that another story was just starting underneath it. The morning after the wedding carried that peculiar stillness that comes when the noise has finally collapsed but the echoes still remain. Laura was sleeping peacefully, her hair spread across the pillow in quiet waves, while I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the envelope I had found in my pocket. The sunlight slanted through the curtains in thin gold bands that made the dust in the air shimmer like faint ash. I kept reading the words written on the back of the photograph as if repetition might alter their meaning. She told me everything. We should talk soon. The message felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. Downstairs, the hotel breakfast room was mostly empty save for a few guests nursing coffee after the celebration. I sat alone by the window watching cars drift through the morning light while my mind kept circling the same questions. What had my mother told him? Why now? Why at my wedding? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her timing had been deliberate. She wanted this to bleed into my new life. She wanted me to believe reconciliation was inevitable. It was the perfect stage for her version of closure. When Laura joined me, she looked rested but quiet. She asked if I wanted to talk about last night and I nodded. I told her about the envelope, the photograph and the note. She listened without interrupting, then said softly that it was my choice whether to respond or let it go. But I could tell she was worried about what silence might grow into. After breakfast we checked out of the hotel and drove home. The drive was long and filled with those comfortable pauses that usually mean peace, but that morning they felt like the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing against the glass. Once home we unpacked in silence. Laura began sorting through the gifts while I went to the study and placed the photograph on my desk beside the wedding album. The contrast between the two was almost cruel. One image frozen in childhood innocence, the other full of joy earned through scars. I stared at both until my eyes stung. Finally I sat down and wrote a short message to the number that had sent me those texts before the wedding. I wrote that I had found his note and that I was willing to talk once if it would end things for good. Within minutes he replied with a location and a time. The park near our parents' old neighborhood the following afternoon. The next day was overcast, the kind of gray that softens everything. When I arrived at the park he was already there, sitting on a bench under the elm trees where we used to play as kids. For a moment I almost turned around, but something kept me rooted. He looked older but not humbled. There were faint lines around his eyes, yet his posture still carried that same easy arrogance. When he saw me he stood and gestured for me to sit. I stayed standing. He smiled faintly as though he expected that. He began talking almost immediately, saying that Mom had told him about how I still blamed him for the past. He said she had confessed to him that she felt responsible for the way things fell apart between us. According to him, she had told him that the real story was more complicated than I remembered. He claimed she had admitted to interfering back then when he and I were both dating people in college. He said she had encouraged him to pursue Claire behind my back because she thought she was protecting me from a relationship that would have distracted me from my studies. I stared at him, wondering if he actually believed this rewrite of history or if he was simply parroting what she had fed him. Either way, it was a clever twist. It placed her at the center of our old conflict as a misguided peacemaker rather than a manipulative instigator. He said he did not blame me for being angry all those years, but that I should understand she had acted out of love. That word love made me laugh under my breath, though it came out as more of a sigh. I told him she did not act out of love, she acted out of control and fear of imperfection. I told him that whatever she had said now was only another attempt to rewrite the past so she could die someday thinking she had held the family together. He did not answer right away, just stared at the ground, scuffing the toe of his shoe against the dirt. Then he looked up and said that he wanted to make things right before it was too late. The phrase "before it was too late" caught my attention. I asked him what he meant and he hesitated before saying that Mom had not been feeling well lately. Something about her heart, he said, though she had refused to tell anyone details. He claimed she had confided only in him because she knew I would react with distance rather than care. For a brief moment guilt crept into me like a crack in armor. Was she sick? Was this her way of forcing a final reconciliation before leaving us? I wanted to doubt him, but the tremor in his voice when he mentioned her health sounded almost real. I told him that if she was truly unwell I would check on her myself, but that did not excuse what she had done. He nodded as if accepting my terms, then said something that unsettled me more than anything else. He said she had left something for me, a box she had asked him to deliver after the wedding. He pulled a small wooden box from his coat pocket and handed it to me. It was polished dark wood with a tiny brass clasp, the kind of thing she used to keep letters in. I took it hesitantly, feeling the weight of it in my hands. He said she had told him it contained the truth about everything and that once I opened it I would finally understand. Then he smiled, that same infuriating smile that meant he believed he had won some invisible argument. He patted my shoulder, walked past me and left the park without another word. I stood there for several minutes staring at the box, hearing the faint hum of traffic beyond the trees and the sound of rain beginning to fall. Back home I placed the box on the kitchen table and sat there staring at it while Laura cooked dinner. I told her what had happened and she suggested I wait until morning to open it, that maybe I needed rest before facing whatever was inside. She was probably right, but as the evening stretched on, curiosity gnawed at me. When she went to bed I returned to the table, turned the latch and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of old letters tied with a thin blue ribbon and a photograph folded neatly beneath them. I untied the ribbon and unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was my mother's. It began with my name, and then the first line made my hands shake so badly I had to put the page down. She wrote that there were things about our family that she had hidden for years and that she could no longer carry the weight of that secrecy. The letter ended mid-sentence as if it were part of a larger confession. The second letter beneath it was addressed not to me but to Mark. I stared at the two envelopes side by side, the air around me feeling suddenly too still. I had the sense that the truth she had promised was not the kind that healed anything, but rather the kind that shattered what little piece was left. That night the house seemed to shrink around me as though the walls were drawing closer with every passing minute. The wooden box sat in the center of the table, its polished surface reflecting the dim kitchen light in uneven streaks. The letters inside waited with the kind of quiet that feels deliberate. I tried to convince myself that opening them could wait until morning, but the thought of leaving them sealed felt worse than whatever I might find inside. I made a pot of coffee even though it was past midnight, then sat down again and untied the blue ribbon with shaking fingers. The second letter was addressed to Mark, yet the envelope was not sealed. I took it out carefully, unfolding the pages that had yellowed slightly at the edges. Her handwriting filled every inch of space in looping sentences that leaned into one another as though she had written them in a single breath. The words began with an apology and then quickly turned into something darker. She wrote about our father, about mistakes she said she could no longer keep hidden. She admitted that during the early years of their marriage there had been another man, someone she had known before meeting Dad, someone who had briefly returned to her life. She wrote that she had believed the affair would stay buried forever and that she had convinced herself it was harmless because it had lasted only a few months. Then came the part that made my stomach twist. She said she had never been certain which man was Mark's father. I sat back hard in the chair as if the air had been punched out of me. My first thought was denial, that she could not have meant it literally, but the tone of the letter left no space for misunderstanding. She wrote that she had always loved both of us equally, yet had felt a secret guilt that she could not love us the same way because she had built her family on a lie. The rest of the letter rambled through fragmented memories, half confessions, half prayers. She ended by asking Mark to forgive her and to understand that the truth did not change who he was in her eyes. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to think. If what she wrote was true, then all those years of rivalry, all that distance between Mark and me, had grown out of something neither of us even knew existed. I reached for the first letter again, the one addressed to me. Maybe she had written it as the other half of this confession. The first page repeated the same apology but in gentler language. She said she had spent years watching the two of us drift apart and that every attempt she made to fix it only deepened the wound. She admitted she had interfered with my past relationships not because she wanted to protect me but because she feared losing control of the only part of her life she still understood. She said that Mark's charm reminded her of the man she had betrayed Dad with and that I reminded her of the man she had chosen to stay with. Every time she looked at us together she saw her mistake mirrored twice. By the time I reached the final paragraph the letters were trembling in my hands. She ended with a line that seemed to echo through the room. The truth was always between you two, not because of what you did but because of what I did. That single sentence reframed everything I had ever believed about my family. I sat there until the coffee went cold. Outside the rain had stopped and the street light across from our window flickered faintly against the wet pavement. Laura came into the kitchen wearing a robe, her eyes heavy with sleep. When she saw the papers spread across the table she asked quietly if I had found what I was looking for. I told her I was not sure yet. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat opposite me without speaking. I handed her the letters and watched her eyes move across the pages, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something like sorrow. When she finished, she placed them gently back on the table and said that this was not something I could solve tonight. She told me to try to rest, but I knew sleep was impossible. The next morning I called my father. His voice was cautious when he answered, as though he already knew why I was calling. I asked him if Mom was sick and if any of what she had written could be true. There was a long silence followed by a sound that was half sigh, half groan. He said that he had suspected for years but had chosen not to ask. He said he had stayed with her because he loved her and because he thought some truths were better left unspoken. Then his voice broke slightly as he added that maybe he had been wrong about that. He told me she had left the house 2 days earlier to stay with a friend by the coast and that she wanted time alone to think. After the call, I stood in the kitchen staring at the window where the morning light cut across the counter in pale gold streaks. I wondered if Mark had read his letter yet and what he would do once he did. I considered calling him, but every instinct told me to wait. Instead, I sat down and wrote a short message saying only that I had read what she left us and that I needed time. He replied almost instantly with 3 words. "Me too, brother." It was the first time in years he had called me that. The simplicity of it made my throat tighten. That evening Laura suggested we drive to my parents' house to gather the rest of Mom's belongings before she returned. She thought it might help to see things clearly. The drive there was quiet, the road wet and glistening from the morning rain. When we arrived, the house felt smaller than I remembered and carried the faint scent of lavender and old paper. In the living room on the mantel above the fireplace was a small framed photo of all 4 of us taken when I was maybe 12. Mark stood on one side of Mom while I stood on the other. The resemblance between them was subtle, but now that I knew what I knew, it felt unmistakable. In her study we found another envelope resting on the desk labeled for both my sons. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key. The note said only this: "The key is to the cottage by the coast. I am there. Come if you wish to understand." I held the key in my palm, feeling its cold edges press into my skin. Laura looked at me and said she would drive me there if I wanted. I nodded slowly, though part of me was afraid of what waited beyond that door. The letters had already changed everything I thought I knew. Whatever was left inside that cottage might finish the work completely. The following morning arrived pale and heavy with mist, as if the sky itself wanted to muffle whatever came next. Laura packed a small bag with the kind of quiet efficiency she used whenever life turned uncertain, while I stood by the doorway turning the small brass key in my hand over and over. Neither of us spoke much on the drive, the air between us thick with questions too big for words. The road to the coast curved through low fields that smelled faintly of rain and salt. The closer we got, the more I could feel that old childhood ache that came whenever I neared my parents' summer cottage. I had spent so many warm weekends there, learning to fish with Dad and racing Mark down the dunes. It had once felt like a place untouched by the complicated weight of family, but now even the memory of it seemed tainted. When the cottage finally appeared at the end of the narrow road, it looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had peeled to a soft grey and the windows reflected nothing but the pale morning light. I stepped out of the car, feeling the wind tug at my jacket. The front door was locked, but the key turned easily in the rusted handle. Inside it smelled of damp wood and sea air. There was a faint hum of gulls outside and the slow rhythmic crash of waves. My mother was sitting at the small kitchen table by the window, wrapped in a shawl. For a moment she looked almost peaceful, as if she had been waiting for me exactly as I appeared. When she saw Laura, she smiled politely and motioned for her to sit, then looked back at me with eyes that carried more fatigue than I had ever seen in them. She said she knew I had read the letters. I nodded and she looked down at her hands folded on the table. Her fingers trembled slightly when she spoke. She told me she had been planning to tell us the truth years ago, but every time she tried, she convinced herself that silence was mercy. She said she had written the letters when her doctor told her she needed surgery for a heart condition and she was afraid she might not survive it. She did not want to leave the world without at least trying to set things right. She said that Mark had known pieces of the story for a few months because she had told him when he came to visit after his last business trip. That was what she meant when she told him everything. I asked her what she expected me to do with this knowledge now. She looked out the window toward the sea and said she wanted us both to stop being enemies for something that was never our fault. She said her greatest mistake had been trying to shape our lives around her guilt instead of letting us live them freely. She said she was sorry but that she also understood if forgiveness was not possible. Her voice wavered near the end like the last flicker of a candle. Mark arrived not long after. I heard his car crunch on the gravel outside and then his footsteps at the door. He stepped in quietly, nodding to me before walking over to her. For a long moment the three of us stood there in a silence that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Then he said he had read his letter too and that he had spent the last day driving with no destination trying to decide what to feel. He looked at me and said that maybe we were both victims of the same secret. I could see in his eyes the same confusion I felt. We spent the rest of that afternoon sitting together in that small room while the light shifted slowly from grey to gold to deep orange. She talked about the early years of her marriage, the loneliness, the fear, the need to feel chosen again. She cried when she said she had loved Dad even while betraying him because love and weakness had somehow coexisted inside her. She admitted that she had tried to control us because she could not control her own shame. She said she was not asking for forgiveness, only for understanding. When the sun finally dipped behind the horizon, she reached for our hands, one on each side, and said quietly that the truth had cost her everything except her sons and that she hoped it would not take us from each other too. Mark squeezed her hand and I did the same, though the gesture felt fragile, like something borrowed. For the first time in years we sat without any need to fill the silence. There was nothing left to argue about. Later, as night settled, she went to her room to rest and Mark and I stepped outside. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of salt and wet stone. We stood there watching the faint light from the cottage window flicker through the mist. He said he did not know how to move forward from this, but that maybe it was time we tried. I nodded because there was nothing else to say. We had both inherited her mistakes and maybe the only way to end them was to stop replaying them. When we left the next morning she was still asleep. I placed the letters back on the table beside her and added a short note telling her that I would visit again soon. The drive home was quiet but lighter somehow. The clouds had lifted and the road shimmered in the sunlight. Laura reached over and took my hand, resting it on her knee. I realized then that closure was never a single moment but a slow unfolding of understanding. In the weeks that followed I began to speak with Mark more often. The conversations were cautious at first, circling safe topics before occasionally touching the past. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was a start. My mother had her surgery later that month and though recovery was slow she survived. We visited her together one afternoon and when she saw us both in the doorway her eyes filled with tears. For the first time in my life those tears were not manipulative or pleading, they were simply human. Looking back now I think about how easy it is to let other people's secrets define our choices. I spent years believing my anger was protection when in truth it was just another form of inheritance. Maybe peace is not about rewriting the story or pretending it never happened. Maybe it is about finally acknowledging that the cracks in a family do not always need to be sealed. Sometimes they just need light to pass through them so that everyone can see clearly at last.